So we are going to spend the next half hour talking about the transmission of collections of Midrashim from their composition in the early rabbinic period through to their use in medieval Europe and then beyond that towards the modern era. So to begin, I need to make sure that we have some basic definitions, understandings about the Midrash collections, as opposed to the concept of Midrash generally. So there are two basic categories of Midrash collections, Midrash Halacha and Midrash Agadah. Midrash Agadah really has no halachic material. Midrash Halacha does have some material that we would call Agadic material, but it is a small subset. Most of that is actually contained in sections that are probably external texts that were inserted. So really, the names are apt. Midrash Halacha is from the Tannaitic period. The collections, in the form we have them, reached their final form in probably the 30 to 50 years after the completion of the Mishnah, but most of the material is undoubtedly older. Many of the traditions in the Midrashim are readings of particular phrases from the Torah text that are the grounding for the Mishnah, the basic insight from which the Mishnah's halacha emerged, even though the Mishnah, based because of the style genre of the text, really systematically omits, for the most part, references to the psukim on which halachot are based. Midrash Agadah is later. It is composed in the Amoraic period. It is the earliest collections of Midrash Agadah were composed in the 4th to 7th centuries, to somewhat overlapping with the Yerushalmi, which reached completion at the end of the 4th century, but also continuing well after that. There are, of the various books of Midrash Halacha, of Midrash Agadah that we have, a few of them are clearly from the earliest period, Bereshit Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah, most notably Psikta de Rav Kahana, which is a series of Midrashim on the Torah readings for festivals, and a couple of the ones on Megillot. But there are also, and this is part of the story we'll tell, numerous collections of Midrash Agadah that were composed/compiled in later centuries as well. Both types of Midrash were composed entirely in Eretz Yisrael. That is an important fact that we will spend some time talking about as we go on, but I just want to point that out for the moment. There are examples of kind of later texts that try to imitate the style of the earlier texts with Midrash Agadah. That is plentiful. There are later Midrashim and collections that look like Midrash Agadah, but do not have the same sort of clarity or well-developed thought. The characteristics of really careful and nuanced reading of the language of the biblical source. But nonetheless, that material was still being produced. The most well-known example of an imitation of the style of Midrash Halacha is in the Haggadah, the whole middle section of Magid that is a midrash in the form of midrash halacha on the text Arami Oved Avi from Dvarim. It's a very simple midrash. It is so simple that for a long time there were scholars who tried to argue that it was very, very early midrash. This is what midrash first looked like in the Second Temple period. That has been pretty soundly rejected as a theory at this point. Its problem is not that it's so early and undeveloped, it's that it's just not very good. The authentic midrash, Tanaitic midrash halacha, is subtle. It is based on really, really close reading of and picking up on fine nuances of the language of the biblical text. A midrash will always take the source in some new direction, add some layer of meaning. Not so the midrash text in the Haggadah, which is mostly just connecting this phrase to a phrase from elsewhere, either from Shemot or elsewhere in Tanakh, that means this, talks about the same thing, or happens to use the same words. Okay. Midrash halacha is very much a part of the early rabbinic project. As I said, the Mishnah is the halachot of the Mishnah are very much derived from the Torah. They are derived from the Torah through Midrash. And even though the Mishnah doesn't include the underlying insights that lead to it, they are essential. So the Midrash Halacha collections are closely related to and very much part of the same project as the Mishnah. That's not true of Midrash Agadah. First of all, Midrash Agadah is not concerned with halacha and the Talmud project at all. It is entirely sort of about finding various types of meanings in especially the biblical narratives, although not only. There are some Midrash Agadah books that are really focused on filling in the gaps in narrative, especially Breshit Rabbah and Esther Rabbah are the best examples. There are others that are really more about using psukim as jumping off points for homiletical or and ethical teachings. Vayikra Rabbah is a classic example of this. Also, Eicha Rabbah. But either way, they are their own genre of teaching and of thinking. So this is not to say that the authors of Midrash Agadah were not rabbinic Jews or not part of the rabbinic community. They certainly were, and there is a certain amount of shared material between the Talmud Yerushalmi and especially Breshit Rabbah, although that's probably Agadah material that kind of got grafted onto the Talmud. But they're part of one community, but they're they're different and unrelated projects. Midrash Agadah was composed also for a different purpose. Midrash Agadah is addressed to a public audience. There are lots of features that make that clear, and in the way that if you are a rabbi in a shul, or you're giving a Dvar Torah, you're going to talk about the parsha and you're going to draw lessons from it and connect it to everyday life, or draw connections between different biblical stories. But you're not going to like teach a fine point of halacha. That's what these midrashim do, which is why ultimately they continued to be composed well after in Eretz Yisrael, well after the Yerushalmi was signed and sealed, and why the body of Midrash Agadah continued to expand and grow. One more jump back to Midrash Halacha, because it will be important for the next stage of the story. So, in terms of Midrash Halacha, Midrash Halacha material can be divided broadly into two schools, two approaches, two methodologies, known as the school of Rabbi Yishmael and the school of Rabbi Akiva. While the collections don't all kind of neatly break down into one or the other, the styles are very distinct. The school of Rabbi Yishmael is very restrained. They try to see Midrash as allowing the Torah's voice to be expressed, and therefore it reads the Torah through a series of concrete, defined hermeneutical rules for interpretation, on the thinking that if you are simply applying a rule, then essentially what comes out was already part of the text itself, was already embedded. And therefore, it's the text speaking to us, not me speaking to you. Midrashim of the school of Rabbi Yishmael tend to be more limited in their scope. They tend to stay closer to original meanings. They try to avoid offering multiple interpretations of the same word or phrase, and they are really about finding nuance in the text with a fine comb. The school of Rabbi Yishmael is different and is opposite in all of those ways. It is freeform. It is imaginative. It jumps off and takes the text in all sorts of directions that are not suggested by anything inherent to the text itself. The Sifra on Vayikra will offer 8 or 10 or 12 different perushim on the same word or phrase with no qualm. There's lots of speculation. You could summarize by saying Rabbi Yishmael tells you what they believe the text does mean, and Rabbi Akiva is really exploring what the text could mean in all of that range. The Mishnah is much more closely associated with the school of Rabbi Akiva. The Tanaim in the Mishnah are the same Tanaim that are mostly featured in Rabbi Akiva texts. The Mishnah aligns much more frequently with rulings and halachot presented in Rabbi Akiva texts. Sometimes a Rabbi Akiva text, given that the Midrashim were reached their final form in the decades after the Mishnah. The Rabbi Akiva text will sometimes derive a rule and then say, Mikan Amru, based on this, the Mishnah said, and actually quote the Mishnah. Whereas the Midrashim of Rabbi Yishmael sometimes match with the Mishnah and sometimes are conflict with it. The Tanaim named in it are actually a completely different group of Tanaim for the most part, which is striking. A whole group of Tanaim who, if the evidence of the Mishnah is to be trusted, kind of are eclipsed once the Mishnah becomes the central text. Originally, and this is the last crucial point about Midrash Halacha, Originally, there's only Midrash Halacha on the 4 books of the Torah that have Halacha, not Bereshit. But originally, it is pretty clear that each school compiled books of Midrashim on each of those 4 books. So there were at least 2, if not more, collections of Midrash, one from each school on each of the 4 halachic books of the Torah. That is not what was passed down through the generations. What was known as Midrash Halacha up until the mid-20th century, which we'll get to, were one book of Midrash on each of those 4 books of the Torah. The ones on Shmot and Bamidbar reflect the style of Rabbi Yishmael, the Sifra on Vayikra, and most of the Sifrei on Devarim reflect the style of Rabbi Akiva. And that was not the original situation. We're going to talk in a minute about how that may have come about. But the Talmudim do have and use Midrashim from both schools, even though Rabbi Akiva's Midrashim are more, Midrash is more closely connected to the Mishnah. The Talmudim do draw on and quote Braitot Midrashim from both schools. Okay. Eretz Yisrael. Midrash was a major occupation and an ongoing one in Eretz Yisrael. That's where they were all composed. That is because, first of all, in the rabbinic community in Eretz Yisrael, always kept the different parts of the rabbinic enterprise separate. They were often separate people there were specialists, and they were collected in separate places. So Talmud was in the Talmud. That's why there's so little Agadic material in the Talmud, whereas the Bavli, everything's mixed together. There are collections of Midrash. Liturgy was also being composed in Eretz Yisrael at this time. All the early great piyutim, and we'll talk about them in one of the later sessions, were the early great liturgists were from this same period in Eretz Yisrael. Now, Midrash also continued to be an occupation in Eretz Yisrael long after it seems that Talmud really no longer was. Meaning, the Yerushalmi is concluded in around 400. It's pretty clear that it reached the form that we have. We have 000 record of what they did with that Talmud in Eretz Yisrael for the ensuing centuries. They did preserve it. They did. Right. It was part of their heritage, but there's nothing added to it. There's nothing added to it. There is no record of further halachic material being produced. By contrast, the 4th century was just the Midrash Agadah was just getting started. Midrash Agadah was part of and teaching Torah in public through Midrash was a major activity in the community of Eretz Israel. It's actually, there's a really nice parallel to our own context where you rarely outside of the Orthodox community, you rarely, and even there, you rarely see popular books saying new things about halakha. And usually popular books would be just organizing and summarizing and simplifying the existing rules, but there is a constant stream of new parshanut of Divrei Torah and other commentaries on the Parsha, and more generally on Tanakh being produced. People are, think about the 929 project and other things. People are always interested in sort of in the wider community in studying and teaching about Torah, and there are always new things to say about it. Now, this also means that, as we mentioned, over those centuries, new collections of Midrash Agadah were being produced, and that when we look, for instance, at the Karageniza, there's much more Midrash material found in the Geniza than Talmud material. This is much more true of Midrash Agadah than Midrash Halacha, right? I think mostly in that era, Midrash Agadah is what was being both produced and studied and used. There's a lot of Midrash Agadah material. There are scattered fragments of the Yerushalmi. Those have been very helpful to scholarship, but scattered. It was obviously not a significant occupation. But Midrash, there's a tremendous amount of Midrash. Midrash was continuing to be studied, not in Bavel, but in Eretz Yisrael and the other communities that were sort of more in its sphere of influence. Now, what's really fascinating is when we now shift our attention to Europe. Recall that all the Midrashim come from Eretz Yisrael. The Babylonians certainly had the Midrash Halacha, and they utilized it, whether in the form of full collections or not, it's hard to know. But they certainly do not engage independently with Midrash collections, and they do not produce Midrash on their own. Even the Midrashic material that you find in the Bavli, which is again not a separate collection, but in the Bavli, is simplistic and clunky and clearly the product of people who had not developed the art of engaging with the biblical text. But nonetheless, over the Gaonic period, the Gaonim in Babylonia established their Torah as Torah large as the primary source for Jewish life, Jewish practice, the thing that should be the primary subject of Jewish study. And the Midrashim did not travel through Bavel. The Midrashim reached Europe directly from Eretz Yisrael. There was definitely a connection between Eretz Yisrael and certainly southern Italy, and from there, material spread to the communities across Europe, perhaps from Egypt or through the North African communities. That is certainly what happened with the Yerushalmi. Right? The Yerushalmi reached Kairouan in Tunisia, presumably directly from Eretz Yisrael, and only then did the rabbis in Kairouan bring it to the Babylonians and say, how do these two things fit together? Now, the Midrash Haggadah was brought to Europe in whole books and collections. Midrash Halacha, because it was really part of the Talmud enterprise that had ceased, that in Eretz Israel they'd stopped engaging in centuries and centuries before. Midrash Halacha had been kind of marginal, it seems, for those 5-6 centuries, which is why the Midrash Halacha collection that reached Europe reached it mostly by happenstance, uh, and why when they had one book on each of one book of Midrash on each of the 4 books of the Torah of Midrash Halacha, there was no suspicion that there might be more. And so that more was never recovered or brought. But in Europe, even though the Bavli is the defining kind of text of Jewish practice, and everyone studies the Bavli, in medieval Europe, study of the Bible takes on a massive importance that it simply did not have in Babylonia. This is because Jews were living in smaller communities and in a kind of harsher climate in terms of relationship to the majority community, more similar to Eretz Israel than Babylonia, but even more because they were living in a Christian society. The Christians read the Bible, and it became very important to assert Jewish understandings of the Bible in contradistinction to the Christian. This is why Rashi, who's the most impactful commentator of the early Middle Ages on basically everything, has this extensive commentary on all of Tanakh as well as the Talmud. In fact, there grew a kind of cottage industry of medieval rabbis interpreting and explaining the text, especially of the Torah, but to a lesser extent also the rest of Tanakh. It became a very important preoccupation of European communities. It's not only is it polemic, although the polemical concerns were a major trigger. As a result of it, and as a result of immersing themselves in studying and interpreting the Bible, engaging directly with the Bible became a central activity for those communities in a totally new way. Now, what's interesting about that is that not only did the medieval communities, right, who didn't have this continuity of tradition that both Eretz Israel and Bavel had, each in their own way, right? A community that may be studying a text from centuries before, but there's a fundamental cultural continuity from that earlier text to the present. I mean, European communities had none of that. Not only did they not know the distinction between the school of Rabbi Ishmael and the school of Rabbi Akiva, enough to notice that, well, this book seems to be from one style and this from another. They didn't really distinguish Midrash Halacha from Midrash Agadah either. Midrash Halacha became part of the pool of old Midrashim that are utilized for their study of the Bible. So Midrash Halacha as collections, there's zero attestation in Babylonia and very minimal record of their study even in Eretz Israel. In medieval Europe, they are reclaimed and they are attended to, but not as part of the Mishnah Halacha corpus, right? Not Midrash Halacha in its origins was really part of the network comprised of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and then the Talmud Yerushalmi, and then the Bavli. Right? That's its milieu. But in medieval Europe, it's Midrash. And it, along with Midrash Haggadah, was read and studied as Midrash, really kind of separately from study and discussion of Talmud and Halacha. Which is what, if you look, for instance, at Rashi's commentary, and if you look at the Torah Chaim or another printing of his commentary that has footnotes that refer you to when he is quoting an earlier midrashic source, which is lots and lots and lots. Until you look at this, you don't realize how much of Rashi's commentary, specifically on the Torah, is drawn almost verbatim or selected from earlier sources. But he uses Mechilta and Shmot Rabbah and Tanhuma kind of indiscriminately, interchangeably. Right? He thinks of them all as midrashic material on Shmot, as opposed to Tanaitic versus Amoraic, early versus late, halachic focus versus narrative or homiletic focus. Now, so the Midrashei Haggadah, which were being studied a significant amount in Eretz Yisrael and North Africa in the say Gaonic period, make it in large quantities to Europe, both in terms of the number of books of Midrash that are brought to Europe and disseminated in European communities, and there are simply multiple manuscripts, copies of those Midrashim. They are found all over the place. Midrashei Halacha, only certain of the collections of Midrash Halacha made it to Europe. Even those tended to exist in far fewer numbers of manuscripts, although certainly much more than, say, the Tosefta or the Yerushalmi, because European communities were regularly engaged in the study of the Torah through the eyes of Midrash. The fact is that actually falls off after the first few centuries. And so there's actually much less attention to and study and preservation of either type of any of those midrashic collections after, say, the 14th, 15th century. And the reason is that they have essentially been superseded. Right? You start having early versions of what we would call a mikraot gedolot. Right? Once there is an accepted almost canon of medieval interpreters, there's no longer a need for the older material. People study the Torah with Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Ramban and various other medieval Parshanim. Some of those Parshanim draw heavily on the early Midrashic collections, and through them, those Midrashic traditions are preserved. Others specifically do not use the Midrashic lens. Ibn Ezra is very interested in linguistics. The Rashbam tries to sweep away the Midrashic layer and get at Pshat. But that becomes the library of commentary that accompanies Bible study, which is why it has a real heyday in the first few centuries in medieval Europe, and then they do get printed, but they're printed in editions that are they're rarely reprinted and not kind of carefully done editions, because by the time of the printing press, the early 1500s, Midrash was no longer a major interest. Instead, they invested in printing the Gemara with Rashi and then Rashi and Tosfot, and printing the text of the Torah with the early medieval commentators. I will say one last thing. There are several amazing stories of modern scholars culling either references to missing Midrash Halacha collections or culling from some of those later Midrash Agadah collections snippets that seem to be Midrash Halacha, a different and earlier style, and positing, oh, these must have been part of an early Midrash Halacha Tannaitic collection. And then finding evidence of or actual copies of sections of those very texts in the Karageniza. It's quite amazing. Those lost collections left traces, right? In a place like the Karageniza, we found snippets. Who knows if there are more? There are always people finding new little pieces of that puzzle. But the fact that we've rediscovered them now doesn't change the fact that they have been absent from the Jewish conversation for 1100, 1200 years. So we are rediscovering a piece of the tradition from that early period, but not one that has been that impacted the rest of the Jewish conversation. Okay, that is our story for Midrash. Next, we're going to talk in the next session. The next two sessions will be devoted to the Talmud. We'll talk briefly about the Yerushalmi. We'll talk more at length about the transmission of the Bavli, and how the reception of the Bavli in Europe changed both European Judaism and the Talmud itself.